It's late and the work is done. Not finished in the sense that life is ever fully finished, but today's portion of it is behind you. The messages were answered. The tasks on the list are mostly gone. The necessary conversations happened. The obligations were handled. You moved through the day the way you usually do, which is to say, adequately, reliably, without visible incident. And now you're here, at whatever hour this is, and you are tired in a way that doesn't quite add up. That is the first thing worth naming tonight. Not tiredness in the ordinary sense. Not the predictable fatigue that follows a hard day with a clear cause attached. Something more illegible than that. Because if you look at the day honestly, nothing in it was extreme. Nothing demanded more than you had. And still, the weight of sitting here now is heavier than the actual contents of the day would seem to justify. That gap is the state this session is about. There is a particular quality to an evening like this. It is not the evening after disaster. It is not the aftermath of overextension so obvious that it explains itself. It is the evening after adequacy. The evening after a day that worked. And that is exactly what makes the state harder to identify. When something clearly goes wrong, the meaning of the tiredness is available immediately. You know why you feel the way you feel. Tonight is different. The day was coherent, functional, legible. The outside of it can be described without difficulty. What is harder to describe is the way the inside of it failed to fully register while it was happening. If someone asked how the day was, you would probably say, fine. Not because you are hiding something, because fine, in the external sense, is accurate. The work moved, the sequence held. You remained intact throughout it. But there is a difference between a day that was fine and a day that was inhabited. A difference between getting through a day and actually being inside what the day contained while it moved past you. That difference rarely gets named because it usually leaves no visible evidence behind it. But by the end of the evening, it does leave something. It leaves this kind of tired. If you run back through the hours, the shape of the day is probably still accessible. Morning beginning the way mornings usually begin. The first set of tasks establishing the pace. Messages arriving. Small decisions. Small completions. Frictions that stayed within manageable range. Perhaps one or two moments of pressure. Perhaps one or two things that took more than they should have. But nothing decisive. Nothing that would qualify as the reason for arriving here this depleted. And that matters. Because one of the defining features of this state is not merely tiredness, but tiredness without a proportionate narrative. There are moments during days like this that often pass too quickly to be noticed while they are happening. A task gets completed, and for a second, there is no felt relationship between you and the thing you just finished. An email is sent, and it reads correctly, sounds like you, does what it needed to do, and still carries a faint sense of having been produced by a competent operational version of you, rather than by full presence. A meeting ends. A conversation resolves. A decision gets made. And the result is appropriate, useful, adequate. Yet what is missing is not quality. What is missing is contact. Most of the time, those moments do not stop the day. They do not even interrupt it. The next task appears. The next reply is needed. The sequence continues. The machinery of a functional life is built to absorb exactly this kind of minor inner discrepancy without slowing down. That is part of why the state survives for so long without becoming explicit. The structure does not require you to feel fully inside it in order to keep producing results. It only requires continuity. And continuity, for many people, is something they are extremely good at supplying even after other forms of participation have thinned. So, by the end of an evening like this, the tiredness has a distinct texture. It is not simply bodily fatigue, although the body may be carrying part of it. It is the weight of a day that was processed more than lived. A day that completed itself externally without leaving much behind internally. Not because it was fake, not because it did not happen, but because too little of it was fully received while it was occurring. By the time the quiet arrives, what remains is not the day itself. It is the absence of residue from a day that should have left more. What usually follows is some form of accounting. The state is uncomfortable enough that it calls for explanation, and so, directly or indirectly, the mind begins to audit. You go back through the week looking for what would make the arithmetic work. A few nights of bad sleep, a dense cluster of demands, a conversation that took more than expected, a stretch of low-grade pressure that did not seem severe at the time, but perhaps accumulated more than you realized. These are plausible explanations, and sometimes they are partly correct. But the problem with this kind of audit is that the numbers never quite settle. Even when you grant the week its harder points, even when you are generous about the low-grade costs, something in the depletion still exceeds the visible cause. That is the quiet frustration built into this state. The explanations available are close enough to be tempting and inaccurate enough to remain unsatisfying. You can almost explain it, but not quite. There is a more private version of the audit that goes deeper than workload, and it usually produces more discomfort. Not how much you did, not how hard the week was. Something more exact than that. What in the week actually reached you while it was happening? What in it left any trace beyond completion? What in it felt lived rather than discharged? If you run that inventory honestly, the results are often thin, not absent, thin. A few moments that were pleasant enough, a conversation that briefly felt real, a task whose completion felt clean without feeling meaningful, a fragment of contact here and there, but less than there should have been, given the actual amount of life that passed. That is a different kind of imbalance. Not between effort and recovery, between experience and registration, between the objective density of the week and the amount of it that actually arrived as lived reality inside the person moving through it. Once that becomes visible, the depletion starts to make more sense, not as overwork, but as a form of ongoing expenditure that ordinary workload language does not describe. There is a kind of tiredness that carries dignity because it has a clear cause attached. You worked hard. You extended beyond capacity. You can see why the body or mind is asking to recover. There is a moral simplicity to that version. Cause and effect align cleanly. What makes this other state harder is that it lacks that visible alignment. The week was manageable. The day was ordinary. The demands were within range. And still, the tiredness is heavier than the visible facts seem to justify. This is where many people misread themselves. They assume the problem must be hidden overwork, or some subtle gratitude failure, or weak motivation, or low mood not yet clearly formed. But none of those descriptions quite touch the specific structure here. The problem is not just that a lot was asked of you. The problem is that what was asked of you was carried out under conditions of reduced inner contact, and that has its own cost. A cost that scales differently. A cost that does not show itself during performance. A cost that becomes visible mainly at the edges of the day, when output stops, and what remains is the quality of what the output required from you. There is something specific about sustained competence that almost never gets examined clearly enough. When you remain the person who handles things, people do not experience you as depleted. They experience you as dependable. They see continuity. They see function. They see someone who continues to answer, decide, respond, carry, manage. And that reading is not false. The competence is real. The issue is not that the competence is fake. The issue is that competence reveals almost nothing about the internal conditions under which it is being maintained. Think about the kinds of roles that accumulate around people who function well. The person others can count on. The person who does not make things harder. The person who keeps sequence when sequence is needed. The person who can be reached. The person who can absorb and respond without much visible distortion. These roles produce social trust, and that trust becomes structurally important. Other people begin, often unconsciously, to build some of their own stability around your continued intactness. That is part of why the maintenance cost becomes so private. When your reliability has held for a long time, the expectation of reliability stops feeling like an expectation and starts feeling like the natural order of things. The social environment no longer notices the functioning because it has become baseline. It is simply what you are assumed to do. And if the inner conditions underneath that functioning begin to change, if the quality of presence behind it becomes thinner, more mechanical, more distant, the output can still remain stable enough that nobody receives a signal. This is where the state becomes difficult not only to explain to others, but to perceive accurately in yourself. Because if the emails are still good, the conversations still basically work, the decisions are still sound, and the life remains visibly coherent, what exactly is supposed to count as evidence that something has shifted? The evidence does not exist in the results. It exists in the private maintenance required to keep producing those results from a place that is no longer fully inhabited. There is a specific strain in appearing fully present while actually operating at a slight remove. Not deception. Not performance in the theatrical sense, something subtler than that. You are present enough to do what is needed, present enough to remain useful, present enough to sound attentive, to be accurate, to respond in the right register. But the difference between functional presence and full participation is larger than it appears from outside. And sustaining that difference through an entire day costs something. You can feel this most clearly in interactions that go well and still leave almost nothing behind. A conversation where you said the right things and perhaps even meant them, And yet afterward, there is no sense of contact remaining from it. A meeting that was efficient and successful and somehow internally blank. A useful exchange with someone you care about that should have produced some residue of closeness, but instead leaves only the fact that it occurred. These are not dramatic failures. They are successful operations with diminished inward registration. And when enough of a life is built out of operations that succeed outwardly while registering lightly inwardly, the cumulative drain becomes serious. This is the maintenance cost of remaining reliable, not the work itself, the work of staying externally coherent, while the internal depth behind that coherence has become thinner than it used to be. The body does not necessarily announce this during the task. The mind often does not fully register it during the task. It becomes visible later, when the sequence ends and the question is no longer what got done, but what any of it asked of you to keep being done under those conditions. And here is the structural difficulty. The more capable you are, the longer this can continue without interruption. If you were failing visibly, the state would become legible faster. Some form of breakdown would force a new accounting. Something would stop. Someone would ask. You would ask. But when the competence holds, the state remains below the performance line. Invisible to the frameworks that only know how to identify problems once output changes. Invisible even to you for stretches at a time, because the day itself gives you no reason to doubt the continuity of things, until the evening arrives and the arithmetic stops working again. So what is actually being depleted? That question matters, because the general language of exhaustion is not precise enough here. Energy is too broad. Reserves is too vague. The state has a more exact structure than that. And accuracy matters, because the wrong diagnosis always suggests the wrong solution. Start with a simple distinction. There is tiredness that follows effort, and there is tiredness that follows distance. The first is easy to understand. Something real was expended. The body or mind worked hard. And now the systems that supplied that work need recovery, sleep, rest, reduced demand. These belong to the same currency as the depletion. What was spent can, within range, be restored by the same category of intervention. The second kind is different. It softens with sleep, but remains. It eases with a quieter weekend, but reassembles quickly. It does not track cleanly with intensity. It can appear after a moderate week, after an ordinary day, after circumstances that are objectively manageable. Which means what is being depleted is not simply fuel for effort. What is being depleted is the quality of inner participation in what you are doing. That can sound abstract until you place it back in ordinary life. Think of work you are genuinely inside. Not work you merely finish, but work in which attention is actually present. A conversation where your contact with the other person feels real rather than merely correct. A routine in which you are not just completing movements, but inhabiting them. The output may not be better in any measurable sense, but the inner relationship between you and what you are doing is different. There is less gap, less supervision from a distance, less of that strange split between the functioning self and the felt self behind it. Now think of the version where that quality is reduced. The task gets done, but leaves no trace of lived involvement. The conversation functions, but feels slightly formal even from the inside. The routine runs, and you are technically there. And yet, what is happening does not quite meet you while it is unfolding. The difference between these two modes is invisible to most external measures, but internally, it is decisive. A day spent in the second mode produces output without producing inward accumulation. That is why the end of such a day feels so particular. The list is shorter. The obligations were discharged. The day technically happened, and still, there is so little sense of having been inside it that what remains is not completion, but depletion. Time passed. Work was performed. But too little of the passing time became experience in the full sense. There is also a specific kind of mourning that belongs to this state, and it deserves to be named because it exposes the limit of ordinary recovery. It is not a bad morning. You wake and there is some restoration. The body has recovered from yesterday's physical cost. For a few seconds, sometimes a minute, the morning carries a small sense of openness. Then the structure of the day begins to assemble itself. The first responsibilities return. The first motions of routine resume. And almost immediately, the same quality of slight distance reappears. That is diagnostically important. It means sleep did what sleep does, and still did not alter the underlying condition. The body is somewhat fresher. The structure is unchanged. The relationship between you and the structure is unchanged, which means the problem was never primarily bodily in the first place. Sleep restored the category of thing it knows how to restore. What remained was outside its range. This is why there can be weekends that help and still do not solve anything. The pressure lowers. Some obvious fatigue washes out. There may even be moments of real relief. But once the regular sequence returns, the same state begins reproducing itself. Not because the work is unbearable, because the mode of participating in the work has not changed. The life continues to be carried at a distance too small to interrupt function and large enough to drain something over time. That is what makes the exhaustion so specific. It is not merely the cost of doing too much. It is the cost of sustained operation without full inhabitation. The cost of repeatedly carrying a life whose external form still works, while the internal depth of contact with that life has quietly thinned. One of the most important facts about this state is that it does not become obvious by becoming dramatic. It becomes lasting by remaining undramatic. Nothing collapses. Nothing forces a new interpretation. The relationships remain basically intact. The work continues. The schedule holds. And because the world organizes its concern largely around visible dysfunction, the absence of dysfunction becomes the mechanism by which the condition persists. The same is true internally. The available explanations all require a threshold this state does not cross cleanly. Burnout implies a level of load that is difficult to claim honestly when your week was merely full. Depression implies a pattern heavy enough that many people in this state do not recognize themselves in it. Stress is too generic to explain the specificity of the depletion, so none of the usual labels fit exactly enough to organize a response. What happens instead is subtler. The state becomes familiar before it becomes legible. The specific tiredness at the end of the day begins to feel ordinary. The mismatch becomes routine. The evenings that do not land become just how evenings are. The weekends stop carrying the expectation of real restoration, not because you made that decision explicitly, because experience has slowly trained you out of expecting more. There is rarely a clear moment when this shift occurs. That is part of why it is so difficult to trace. If there were a decisive event, the mind would know where to point. But what usually happens is smaller and slower. A gradual flattening. A slight reduction in how much of the day feels inhabited. A slight increase in how much of the day feels processed. A slight adjustment in what counts as normal tiredness. Enough repetition, and the state stops reading as a condition and starts reading as personality. This is just how you are now. This is what weeks feel like. This is adulthood. This is modern life. This is the job. This is the season. This is a busy phase. The explanations multiply, and because each contains something true, none are enough. The normalization is itself part of the diagnosis. The state continues precisely because it does not declare itself loudly enough to interrupt the continuity of the life carrying it. The routines that maintain your functioning also maintain the conditions under which the state can keep reproducing itself. Morning starts. Sequences resume. Tasks move. Messages are answered. The life proves, again and again, that it can continue. And that visible continuity becomes the strongest available argument against the idea that anything structurally meaningful is wrong. But visible continuity is not the same as inward intactness. The fact that everything keeps working does not tell you what it costs to keep it working from where you are now standing inside it. The strongest evidence that the state exists is not failure, it is persistence. The same arithmetic, repeating. The same gap between a day that should not have cost so much and an evening that says otherwise. The same mild freshness in the morning, followed by the reappearance of distance once the structure reassembles. The same sense, week after week, that nothing is dramatically wrong and something is still being steadily spent. That is how this becomes chronic without becoming theatrical. Not through collapse, through normalization. Through the quiet success of a life that keeps running while the quality of presence inside it continues to thin below the threshold of visible concern. So here is where that leaves things at this hour. The day was completed. That matters. The work was real. The output was real. The competence was real. None of that needs to be denied in order to name the other half accurately. The state is not imaginary because the functioning is genuine. It is not an illusion generated by overthinking the evening. The tiredness is real. The fact that it lacks a proportional external cause does not make it less real. It only makes it harder to defend using the language most people have available. What you are carrying tonight is not merely the residue of effort. It is closer to the accumulated cost of living as a reliable structure under conditions of reduced inward participation. A life that continues to be managed. A self that continues to answer, decide, maintain, produce. And beneath that, a thinning in the depth of contact between the person and the life being carried. That is why the day can be objectively fine and still leave almost nothing behind. That is why sleep can help and still not touch the center of it. That is why the state can remain for so long without ever maturing into a crisis dramatic enough to force recognition. The life still works. That is not the contradiction. That is the mechanism. And because it still works, the condition tends to remain unnamed. It gets smoothed over by productivity language, by adulthood language, by everyone is tired language, by the assumption that if obligations were met, then the underlying structure must also be intact. But those are descriptions of the outer continuity, not of the inward terms on which that continuity is being maintained. The more exact description is colder than that. A person can continue functioning well while becoming less fully present inside the functioning. A person can remain reliable while something in the relationship to their own days grows thinner. A person can complete week after week of real obligations and still find, at the edge of the evening, that too little of it landed to justify the cost of carrying it. That is not collapse. It is not failure. It is not even necessarily visible distress. It is a quieter condition than all of those, but it is not vague. It has structure. The structure is this: the continued external success of a life being carried at a degree of inward distance that ordinary rest does not repair, and ordinary language does not accurately name. Tomorrow will probably assemble the way today did. The tasks will present themselves. The sequence will begin again. You will likely remain capable inside it. And by the end of it, the same arithmetic may return. Not because tomorrow was too much, because the underlying condition was already there before tomorrow began. The day was completed. Nothing failed. And by the end of it, nothing landed. That is the exhaustion this session is about.